Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this evening's APM webinar. My name's Robert Allen, APM Branches Manager, and I'll be your host today. Tonight's webinar is NEC4 versus NEC3, and I'm delighted that Richard from Mott MacDonald is back to join us. I believe this is the sixth session around NEC. Richard has kindly allowed us to record all these sessions, and they can be made available on APM YouTube, so don't head there now, hold fire. After the webinar, go and have a look at the other 4 or 5 that's available to you. Richard is great and is open to questions throughout the webinar. So during the webinar, I will try and interject and put your questions to Richard. You can put them in your control panel and I will read them out for you. We'll take questions during and after. This session is due to last for about an hour and a half, but depending on the number of questions that come in, could last around the 1 hour mark. I should say, and I always say this, so anyone who's been to one of our webinars
I know what's coming now, don't I?
You know what's coming. It's my standard joke, but tonight's webinar does come with a health warning. Richard is full of energy and he might actually shout at you just to make sure that you're still awake and with us. He especially gets quite energetic around certain misunderstandings, shall we say, with keywords and terminologies. But with that in mind, I'm not going to talk much more, and I'm going to pass over to Richard from Mott MacDonald to share additional information. So, Richard, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, sir. Much appreciated. So, yeah, we've got a session tonight, everybody, specifically on the changes from NEC3 to NEC4. So, the comparison between the two. I know for a fact that some of you have been using NEC3 for 20 years. Some of you have never seen NEC4, some of you are all busy with NEC4 now. So obviously different people will get different things from this, but hopefully it's a useful summary of where we are with NEC4. As Robert said, questions really anticipated and required just to make this slightly less dull, because contracts fundamentally is dull. We've got a couple of Slido things here which Robert is maintaining and managing. Keen for you to just let us know roughly where you work, what are you into. It's quite helpful. It's not going to change my presentation, to be quite honest, but it's quite good just to have a record of where people are coming in from for these sessions. I can see on the slide we've got 65 odd people in with us at the moment. Maybe that will grow a bit. We'll see how it goes. So go along with those. That's the first one. Which industry do you work in? I don't know whether Robert's going to switch on to the next one. I don't know how that worked quite. We're just trying to get a little bit of engagement from you guys.
Yeah,
it's typical, as most of you know, NEC is pretty much pervasive across the UK infrastructure industry, particularly in civil engineering and, let's say, infrastructure. It is also used in the building sector, possibly not enough, and there are still some diehards that stick with the way they've always been doing things in the building sector. And the JCT is the contract which is most commonly used, I think, still, certainly in the smaller building sector, but there's no reason why NEC shouldn't be used for any construction contract or any contract, to be quite honest, which is what we're talking about. So good list of where we are. Let me know when you want me to carry on, Robert. I'm not quite sure where we are. Okay, who do you work for? This is always fascinating because typically most people come in as consultant. Good to see instant reaction here. A lot of consultants, but also a lot of clients. And really, I guess this presentation is crying out to clients, really, to say, come on, guys, get on with it. You're the one that lead the pack. You're the one that tell the bidders what to bid under. And after 4 years now, 2017 NEC4 came out. After 4 years, you really should have got your head round moving on to the up-to-date version of the contract. So there, you can all see on screen, 59% roughly of our group of now 73 people are consultants, 29% clients, a few subcontractors. Good to have the subcontractors welcome. We very rarely get enough representations from subcontractors, but it's good to see them here today. Hope to see some questions from them. And that's close enough. Move on. And then rough idea, NEC, where are you in NEC? Heard about it, used it, confident, or are happy to stand up and give training on it? That's the sort of my 4 ways of describing where we might think our NEC experience is. Good to see a few confident. Most of us on the call have actually used it a bit, which is good. Still quite a few there, just quotes heard about it. So presumably heard about it means you haven't actually gone further and used it yet. And that's still the issue. That's still where we are in the UK in some sectors. I do a lot of training internationally. I did a set presentation only last week to Sri Lanka, comparing NEC with FIDIC. That will be shared in a way around on the website sometime soon, I'm sure. If you're interested in that, come back to me. But obviously, when we're presenting internationally, people have not even heard of the NEC, even though it's been around for 25 years, mainly because they're always forced to use this FIDIC thing because the banks tell them to use FIDIC. But don't get me started on that because I'll start getting whinging. Move on. That's the NEC experience. And now we'll come back to me and I'll show my screen. And that's where I've got to try and get rid of the webinar. Hang on a minute. And see if I can find the actual presentation. There we go. Okay, so that's the intro slide. That's Richard Patterson. That was in the old days when he used to wear a proper shirt for presentations and a nice tie. Remember those old days when people turned up face to face? So I've been with MacDonald for only 32 years. I joined straight from college after a few years traveling, a couple of years traveling. I'm a civil engineer by background. I'm a dams engineer by technical background, but I wandered into contracts because MacDonald said, I think it'd be a good idea to have a couple of years contracts experience. That couple of years stretched to 6. Started in 1996 and it's still going today. So my job is twofold. I do some real contracts. Currently got a $500 million dam in Lesotho just coming back from tender, which is quite scary. That's with FIDIC. And we're preparing FIDIC contracts in Bangladesh for big water treatment schemes as well. Back to my specialism though, it very definitely is NEC. And I spend a lot of time training and helping people with NEC across MacDonald and around the world. So just one last Slido. Where are you coming from? Just so we get some feel for where you are. Robert's got that under control, I think. Is that working, Robert, or should I just carry on and skip it? I'm not sure. There we go. Obviously got a lot of people in Tring, wherever Tring is. That's quite interesting. Got people in Belfast, Carlisle, Lagos. I'm glad somebody do in the chat tell us where you're coming from in Lagos and why you're interested in NEC, because I'd love to get some NEC training in Nigeria. And that's not fair. I am also interested in Cumbria and East Hampshire, but I must admit I'm most interested in Lagos because that's the way I am. Okay, let's move on. Let's get on with the show, I think, is where we are. Got some idea. Thank you for participating with the Slido thing. Makes it a little bit more interesting. Now then, so in MacDonald, we have a whole series of these bite-sized sessions. We do it pretty much every month. That's roughly the program for this year. That last one, Supervisor, was the last one I did in MacDonald, and I've done it also here for APM. I've got one more on NEC and BIM coming up in a couple of weeks' time. If you're working with MacDonald, then please contact your MacDonald contact, and they'll be happy to invite you into those. We don't make them broadcast to the world like this APM one, but if you are working with MacDonald, we're more than happy to let you in. Right, that's what we've done with APM, and here we are today with NEC3 to NEC4. All of those, as Robert said, are available as resources to you on the APM website. Thank you very much for APM for dealing with that. They've also put up a couple of other documents of ours, which we're happy to share. General intro to NEC, which I would suggest you hopefully is worth a read. Just to give credit where credit's due, the following slide started out when a chap called Richard Patterson was asked to do a presentation for NEC. Proud to say this was the first presentation pretty much ever on NEC4. It's been developed and tweaked a little bit since then, but if you want to go back and see what I said 4 years ago, there's the link, but we'll make it live and bring it up to date a little bit with where we are today. The presentation today focuses on the key changes. I've got a second one available to those that are really keen, which goes into a bit more detail. Also, obviously I'm biased, but I would recommend a little article that I wrote back when, I'm not quite sure now, must be 2017, 18 maybe. Just a little written article on those key changes. So if you want to have a read back and see what you missed during the presentation, hopefully that article is worth a read. You've got a link to it there when the presentation is shared with you. You'll obviously have that link if you so desire. My good friend Rob Gerard has written the book NEC3 and NEC4 Compared. That's published, as you can see, by ICE Publishing. And that's literally a page by page, turn the page, and you've got a track change version to show exactly what tweaks have been made to each clause. So if you are, that's only really relevant to you if you know NEC3 particularly well and want to see the micro detail of what's been changed. Obviously, in a presentation like today, you're not going to get all that micro detail, you're going to get the headlines. To bore you, and just for a very few slides, if you're new to NEC at all, these NEC core principles, I guess the important thing for me to say is they haven't changed. It's still clarity, flexibility, and a stimulus to good management. That's why NEC was drafted for you, and that's why NEC is good for you. In terms of clarity, it's in English. You can read it, which is really quite nice. It's got a very good structure. It's free from, I'm reading the slide. I shouldn't read the slide out. That's very naughty. There's a few tweaks to cover specific local law, and there are 3 of those said tweaks, YUK 1, 2, and 3. There's some for New Zealand, there's now some for Australia, there's some for Ireland. NEC, you'll be glad to know, is spreading like a bit of a rash around the world, and gradually we are patching it with little tweaks for certain issues. That's another subject, not for today. Flexibility, we can do anything. Big jobs, little jobs, any project, any service, any sector. We can do it however we like in terms of different payment options, different contractors' design, level of design, pretty much any procurement strategy, and we can do it anywhere. NEC is super flexible. As a family of contracts, this is what NEC3 had, and I show this as a slide. If you imagine that this space in front of you is where I might need a contract. So as I'm a client, I might need a contract for anything on the x-axis, and it might be a simple job or a fairly complex job. If I want to employ a consultant, I can use the professional services contract. If I want to get something built, I can use the ECC, which is the engineering and construction contract, which some people would suggest is still the main NEC contract. The NEC recognises that contractors do an awful lot of subcontracting, and therefore there is a word-for-word replica of the ECC written as a contract between the contractor and a subcontractor. But those contracts so far on that slide are quite complex. If you've got a relatively straightforward contract, you can use the engineering and construction short contract. That's the minor works equivalent in the NEC family. Again, I could do a whole presentation on the differences between the two. Anybody's got any questions, please do ask. But simplistically, the short contract is designed for low risk, not much contractor design, and priced contracts, either lump sum or bill of quantities. So you haven't got the huge level of flexibility that we have, and we'll see in a minute with the ECC. There's also the engineering construction short subcontract, which is a replica of this contract. So lots of flexibility. There's also a contract for physical services called the term service contract. And there's a short version. You can see a pattern emerging here. NEC also has a framework contract, which is a contract to allow a client and a supplier to, as basically a process to allow them to enter into separate contracts. Those separate contracts could be any of the ones above the line. There's an adjudicator's contract for when it all goes wrong, because you haven't bothered to run the contract properly. You didn't get proper training. Sorry, I get carried away. There's contracts for supply only, So that's when you design something and supply it, you just deliver a thing, whereas if you install it, then you need the engineering construction contract. There's also professional services short contract. That's not relevant, that whole slide I've been talking about for 20 years. Not quite 20 years, but that's NEC3. What is relevant to today is the new members of the family. NEC has had some family members as part of the launch of NEC4. Firstly, the adjudicator's contract has been rebranded and tweaked, and it's now called the Dispute Resolution Services Contract. The reason for that is because it's now not only applicable to an adjudicator, it's also the right contract to use to get somebody onto a new option of NEC, which I'll talk about in a minute, which is the Dispute Avoidance Board, coming later. NEC has also now published a professional services subcontract. So if MacDonald has got a major £10 million contract and wants Arups or ACOM or anybody else to help, it might be appropriate to have a proper back-to-back NEC subcontract. That's now available. Likewise, there's now a subcontract available for the term service contract. In the old days, in NEC3, there was guidance on how to turn the contract into a subcontract. That used to be just an appendix to the guide notes, but now NEC has helped you by actually publishing the subcontract form. Radically, there's now a contract for design, build, and operate. Not something that we see frequently used yet in the UK. This is a different procurement route. This is saying I want somebody to design it, build it, and service it, provide me a service with it for 10 years, 20 years, whatever you want. Super flexible, and I'm looking forward to seeing it used more. At the moment in MacDonald, the only place we've seen that being used or thought about being used at the moment, would you believe it, is in Hong Kong. All of the contracts we've been talking about so far are bi-party contracts, simply between a client and a supplier. The odd one out is the new NEC4 alliance contract. This is where we have more than two parties together to sign up to the same performance targets, and they live or die together. This is the ultimate in contracts designed to encourage collaboration. NEC4, just to get you completely up to date, only in 2021, this year, NEC has now worked with the Institute of, I think it's called the Institute for Workplace and something, I can't remember, but we've now published, NEC has now published a facilities management contract. NEC3, people use the term service contract for facilities management, but we've now published a contract which is much more focused and uses the language of the FM world. So if you are doing FM, please have a look at that new facilities management contract and the short contract. I'll ask Robert if there's any questions in yet. This is purely on members of the family. Any questions at that stage from anybody? If not, I'll foul on. Robert, have you got anything?
Yeah, I'm here, Richard. So Mohammed has asked, where's the different options of NEC3 contract come into this framework?
Okay, coming very shortly, probably on the next slide. Hold up.
That's all the questions done.
That's good. Thank you very much. As if by magic, Ecc4 Flexibility. So this this slide I could have drawn for the PSC or the term service contract. They're pretty much the same structure, but for Ecc4, we've got clauses 1 to 9, which is about 18 pages of text only. And those are called the core clauses, and they're in every ECC contract. This is exactly the same as it was for NEC3. There's no changes here yet. We've still got the same 6 payment options, A to F. Client chooses one of those. Anything from lump sum to target to reimbursable to bill of quantities, you choose. You then, as a client, you choose a dispute resolution option. Oh, hang on, there's some purple on the slide. The purple is NEC4. So NEC3 had dispute resolution options W1, W2, which is adjudication. NEC4, we've got a new dispute resolution option, which is a dispute avoidance board. I think I talk a little bit more about that later. Client chooses one of the three. If I don't talk about that more later, the dispute avoidance board is where, rather than wait for the dispute to happen and bring in an independent adjudicator to make a decision, the board is where we pay people who are good to come along once every 3 months or 4 months or whatever you decide is appropriate, to sit with the teams and try and tease out where disputes are coming and try to get the board then makes a recommendation to the parties, not a decision, but a recommendation. More detail on that may be coming later. I can't remember. If we want it, we can do it. These are the secondary options, and you can see if you've got very good eyesight, you'll see that 6 of those are, oh, one of them's the wrong color. X10 should also almost be purple. Let me write a little note to myself to correct that in the slides. Those are new to NEC4, and we'll talk about those in more detail in 2 minutes' time. Client chooses which secondary options they want. Client chooses which jurisdiction-specific options they want. And then client, if they love to, having chosen this wonderful modular, super flexible contract, you can then go and trash it with a whole load of hopelessly designed Z clauses. He gets carried away about Z clauses. So this is where the client has the opportunity to tweak the standard clauses with what the NEC calls additional conditions of contract, option Z. So, like I said, the only difference between 3 and 4 on that slide, the new dispute resolution option and several new secondary options. In terms of stimulus to good management, it's still the same. Very good on communications, massively important on program. There's a few tweaks to the program clauses that we'll talk about later. Early warning is critical to a good, well-managed NEC contract. Compensation events is the only place a contractor can get money, extra money or time from the client, and they're a key part of any NEC contract. And spare me one moment, NEC compensation events, they're near enough all in one place. Time and cost for all of them. Fundamentally different from any other contract on the planet. They're based not on BOQ rates, but they're based on the forecast real cost of the event. And the biggest word in the NEC, the most important word in the NEC, is that word, the F word. I've actually written an article on it, published on the NEC newsletter called the F words in the NEC. Because, I mean, I hadn't realized it when I wrote it. I do now. That word is the most important word in the contract. When you have something where the contractor can get some extra time or money, you don't just record it and then sort it out later. You're required to forecast it and do a deal. That's where NEC is so different. My apologies to everybody who's listening to this thinking, yeah, Richard, but that's all standard. There's nothing new. I want the new stuff. Okay, let's move on. This is the new stuff. NEC, massive, huge change. I'm joking. We've split 10.1, which used to be one sentence. It's now in 2 sentences. Doesn't really change anything. But the first contract says, the first clause says, do what it says in the chuffing contract. To do that, you're going to have to read the contract. This is my favorite NEC training slide, by the way, so I can't resist using it in any session that I give on NEC. Read the chuffing contract. It's boring. It's dull. I'm sorry, but you can't do NEC unless you're going to read it. And then what on earth does spirit of mutual trust and cooperation mean? Well, the Patterson abbreviation for that is TALTIO. This is my advice to people like Donald Trump and some others. Can we please talk and listen to each other? So read the contract, find out what we've got to do, talk and listen to each other, and then do it as per the contract. That's nothing. I mean, you can see it. Okay, the only change in here from 3 to 4 is we split it up into 2 sentences, but it doesn't change the effect of that clause. Now we'll get into some more detail. I better check my time to make sure we're getting through some of this detail. Where are we? Yeah, I'll carry on, Richard. So the way I've structured the presentation is, as you can see on the slide, new and changed options, general language issues, and then I get into some of the detail on sections 1 to 6. So new change options. Firstly, in the dispute resolution options, W1 and W2, that's where we have an adjudicator. Now in NEC, NEC has replicated what a lot of clients were doing anyway, and before we go to the adjudicator, we give our senior representatives. They're in italics. Sorry, I'm not on a normal training course. I've been training all day today. I say to people, what does that mean? In the contract data, they respond together. So in the contract data, the contractor and the client list senior people that they want to put together to try and do a deal to avoid going off to the adjudicator. Now, the only subtle issue with that in W2, which is NEC's option which matches the Hugh Grant Act, the Housing Grants Act, because that act says that we have to be able to go to adjudication at any time, in W2, the clause to do with senior representatives is optional. But one would hope it would make sense and people would use that option before going off and spending a fortune on adjudication. W3 is, I've already mentioned to you, it's a dispute avoidance board. This is a completely alternative way of addressing and avoiding disputes. The focus is really on avoiding. Question for clients out there, are you going to be radical and use this new option? It means paying people, probably quite expensive people, who have experience in the technical and commercial aspects of your contract to come along and try and help the people avoid disputes. That's, again, it's basically the client investing in avoiding going to adjudication. A warning to you, the option as written actually states that it's not for use in the UK where we've got the Housing Grants Act, but NEC has separately published some guidance on how you can use it in the UK. That's in the construction contract, not in the professional services contract. The senior reps is in both ECC and PSC. There's a new option in any ECC contract, and I'm talking here ECC in most cases. Maybe that's not as clear as I should have made it. X9 is a new secondary option which has been stolen from the professional services contract and essentially passes all of the intellectual property rights of the contractor's design to the client. So contractors, beware of that one. You're probably not going to like it. Undertakings to the client and others. New language, different language, but basically we're talking collateral warranties. NEC3 didn't have collateral warranties. NEC4 does. Option X8. Again, the logic in the changes here, I was a very small part of the NEC team that moved from 3 to 4, and one of the ideas of NEC4 changes generally was to try in certain circumstances to put in words where we knew that the lawyers were always needing or feeling the need to add words. That was the case for collateral warranties, so now we can use option X8. And there's more. What used to be a parent company guarantee, micro change is now an ultimate holding company guarantee. We don't get just the guarantee from dad, we get the guarantee from great grandfather. X10, information modeling. Some of you, there's a small chance some of you might be using this BIM thing. And most contracts are very, very poorly drafted as to how they're going to relate to what's going on with what NEC calls information modeling. If you're interested in that, have a bit of a Google and search for it. I've given a presentation to the BIM for Legal group specifically on X10. Recording on that is out there somewhere on the web. We can probably share it in the follow-up to this session if that's of any use to anybody. What it does is set up the concept of an information model requirements, and an information execution plan. X11 is new, but it's not really. This gives the client the right to terminate at will. It was already in NEC3. NEC4 decided that should be an option and therefore has put it into an option X11. Again, most clients probably will include that option to give them that right, but that's up to the client to decide. X15 has always been called the contractor's design, and it has always reduced the contractor's liability from fit for purpose down to due skill and care. As an independent commercial contractual specialist, I would always advise a client to use X15 because contractors cannot get insurance against fit for purpose, and therefore they will always want to see X15 included. In NEC4, X15 has been expanded with a few words about intellectual property and license to use the contractor's design. Also, requirements to retain the documents, normally for the duration of the liability of the contractor, and also for the first time in NEC, a specific obligation to provide professional indemnity insurance. That was not at all in NEC3. There's an option for whole life cost. These are all the new options. Remember, sorry, they're not all new. So some of those on the slide, sorry. Maybe I should do some more colouring or whatever. X15 has changed. X4 has changed. X10 is new. X21 is new. X21 just prompts the contractor to come up with some bright ideas to reduce whole life cost. And generally, I would recommend that you include that as a client, because why not? It leaves the client in control. You don't have to accept this deal, but basically it gives you the opportunity within the contract, therefore without having to go to an addendum, to make some changes, to do a deal, to change what's being delivered to help reduce the whole life cost of the client having to operate the thing that's being delivered under the contract. Lastly, quite a big one. NEC3, NEC had already published words for ECI, early contractor involvement. Now it's actually included directly as a secondary option, X22. In MacDonald, we're seeing that now being used by almost not frequently, but more clients are using the concept of ECI. What this does is bring the ECI into one single ECC contract with a break clause. So if we can't agree to the price for stage 2 during stage 1, there's a clear break clause. The client can say, off you go, Mr. Contractor, go away. I'm going to go and do it another way. Thus, that's, I think, a good thing. And some of you will have heard of the construction playbook, which is the UK government's guidance document, which came out only a few months ago. That's very strongly supports the concept of ECI, and therefore many of you on this call will be thinking, oh, flipping it, what's this ECI about? How does that going to work? It's there in X22, but you might need a little bit of help to support it. All of these, no, that's not all of these. The ones on the slide, X4, 10 and 11 are also in the professional services contract. Oh, hang on, one line there. One option which is deleted. Oddly, I've never found anybody in NEC to explain to me why this was deleted. NEC3 had the option under the PSC for option G, which is a term contract, allowing a client to let chunks of work, tasks within the same contract. For some reason, that has been taken away from us. And I'm not going to try and explain why it's gone because I don't know. Okay, language. Contracts, obviously, language is important. Yes! Not everybody is a bloke. Isn't that wonderful? NEC has woken up to the fact that not everybody is a bloke. I've been giving training for 20 years on NEC, and the project manager's a bloke, the employer's a bloke, the supervisor's a bloke, everybody's a bloke, bloke, bloke. It's wrong. NEC has changed that. It's wonderfully gender neutral. We need in our industry to train ourselves to talk gender neutral. When we're writing the scope, we need to remember that the contractor is not a bloke. So please, can I put a request out to the industry to try and learn from the way NEC has done that. Another thing where I get very excited, NEC3 had a document called the Risk Register, which confused the pants off of too many people because they confused it with a project risk register, which is not an NEC document. The project risk register quite often has a column to say where we want a risk to lie. The NEC's risk register never had that column. It was not designed for risk allocation. That's exactly the same in NEC4, but just by calling it the early warning register, it makes that a lot easier, believe me, when you're giving training as to how the early warning register works. In the same way, the risk reduction meeting is now an early warning meeting. There's some other rippling changes within the contract. Works information, RIP. It's dead. ECC, we now have a scope. The contractor provides the works in accordance with the scope. Again, that was a levelling up thing where NEC decided let's use the scope in all the big contracts. The employer, dead, now called the client. Don't worry about it, it's only a name change. Employer's risk in NEC3, another wonderful but simple change. It's now called a client's liability, which makes it a lot easier in training to explain the difference between a normal compensation event and a client liability, which gives the contractor more protection from that event. The principle of that hasn't changed, just the name has changed to make it more obvious. That last one is only in the construction contract, not in the PSC, because it never was in the PSC. Okay, that was some general questions at a fairly high level. Obvious breakpoint in case Robert's got any questions.
Yeah, certainly got some questions, Richard. So Ashok has said, did we not have the NHS use the turnkey NEC contracts when building new hospitals?
They did, they still do. The word turnkey is a lovely procurement term which really means design build, and a turnkey contract effectively, going back to my pictures up here, if you want a turnkey contract under NEC, you will use option A because that's a lump sum, and you will tell the contractor to do all the design. That is effectively a turnkey contract. And nothing has changed there between 3 and 4. Okay.
Perfect. Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Ashok, for the question. Gary's asked, can you help define high-low complexity for a professional services contract?
Oh, really good question. Simple answer, no, it's too hard. You really need, as a client, you really need to get to grips with both the PSC and the short contract. I mean, I can, and I shouldn't give too much of my Mott MacDonald crown jewels away. I've got a nice document comparing the two. The PSC contract has the same level of detail about planning and programming as the ECC contract. Lots of detail, lots of hard work when you're trying to do your contract. The short contract simply says the consultant or the contractor, depending on which one we're talking about, provides a program as stated in the scope. So we're trying to minimize the management overhead of all the planning requirements. The PSC has options for lump sum, target, and reimbursable. The short contract can be a mix of priced tasks like quantities or lump sums, and it's also got a provision for work which is what's called on a time charge basis. So the short contract is very flexible as well in terms of payment. The one thing it doesn't have is a target contract option. And as always, when you're comparing the big contract and a little one, there is a lot of difference because they've made it a lot shorter. But all I can say is, in answer to Gary's question, is there's no simple what's a complex contract, what's a simple one. You need to have a look at both the contract with a little bit more understanding to work out what's going to be best for this particular issue. What I would say is that many clients across the UK, I didn't say it at the time, but that professional services short contract in that slide there, that was the last one off the block. That's only been around for 3 or 4 years, I think. Don't quote me on that. But the problem in the industry is that most clients are used to using the PSC and haven't bothered to look at the opportunity with the short contract. Stop.
Excellent. Thank you, Richard and Gary. Robert, and I promise it's not me, has submitted a question. What is the most commonly used contract in the library? ECC? Question mark.
I would guess yes, but I'll tell you that nobody keeps that sort of data, so nobody can really tell you. These contracts, you don't have to buy the contract to use it. Well, you do because you have to know what's in it. But when you let a contract, you refer to the words in these contracts by reference. You don't actually have to buy it to put it in there. And therefore, there's nobody on the planet trying to keep track of exactly how many of these contracts there are. So any data, I can't give you data. I can only suggest that probably the ECC is the most commonly used contract in the UK construction sector of this family. Stop.
Excellent. Thank you, Richard. And final question from Gary. We use PSC option G tasks. Should we move to NEC4 and add option G into the contract, or stick with NEC3?
Oh, that's a really, really good question. You were listening to what I said. It's a really good question. Many of I haven't done it yet myself, but a lot of my sort of companions in NEC SAD enthusiast land have told me they have helped clients develop the equivalent of option G in NEC4 language, because I think there is still a need for that. The idea, if you've got, as a client, if you've got a series of chunks of work that you want doing, a way of doing it is to have a framework contract, and then each of those chunks is a separate contract. The problem with that is that every time you have a new chunk, you've got to go through the legal process, and you've got to go high in your organization probably to get someone to sign a new contract. So clients do like the idea of being able to do that, a new chunk of work, without the paraphernalia of having a new contract. That's why the term contract in G was not, I wouldn't say it was popular. It wasn't very frequent. Well, it wasn't one of the most commonly used PSC contract, but it was used by some clients. So I'm not answering the question very well. If you still want and need to have the opportunity to let a series of tasks, each of those tasks, by the way, had its own completion date. And it was also, if you wanted to, you could put a delay damage against meeting those completion dates. That was all within option G. If you want to do that within NEC4, I'm afraid you're going to have to find somebody who knows NEC to help you write some Z clauses to make that happen. Stop.
Thank you, Richard. You can continue with your presentation.
Okay, it's good to do it in these chunks, I hope. So let's go back to the detail now. So we're gradually going through. We've looked at the new contracts, we've looked at the new options. Now we're getting down into some of the detail. So some of you will know what those numbers mean. If not, you'll find out very briefly. Core clauses, part 1. These are the general clauses. I've already mentioned that 10.1 has been split into 2 clauses. That's a minor detail. Jumping across now to the professional services contract, a key change. Well, maybe it's a key change, but it doesn't really change a lot. NEC4, we now have a service manager. NEC3, PSC3, sorry. PSC3 was a simple contract between an employer and a contractor, and the employer did all the day-to-day management of the contract. Whereas in the ECC world, there has always been a project manager between the contractor and the client. In NEC4, we've now got the role of a service manager, and they do everything the equivalent of the project manager in the construction contract. So they are now they do all the day-to-day management of the contract. The only things that the service manager doesn't do is open their wallet and pay, terminate and dispute. So those are the only clauses left with the client. Strictly, there's a mistake on the slide, because the other one thing that the client can do, wait for it, is change the service manager. But the day-to-day running of the job is done by the service manager, not the client. But there's no real change, because PSC3 used to have an option called the employer's agent, where the client would employ an employer's agent, but then they had to go and tell the agent exactly what clauses they wanted to act under. a lot simpler, in my opinion, under PSC4 because we actually have the service manager. Who that person is up to the client. It could be appointed as a representative, it could be an employee of the client's organization, or for a big consultancy contract, you might choose to appoint a consultant or somebody in from, I was going to say MacDonald, but I can't say that because other consultants are available. Having said that, if you do appoint an external consultant, and because of what I'm going to tell you about soon in this presentation, when it comes to cost and open book issues, there might be potential confidentiality issues if you've got, for example, Arups acting as a service manager for a contract with AECOM. Talk about that a bit later. 2. So 2 is under the contract. I really ought to put this in the slide, didn't I? 2 is the contractor's or the consultant's main obligations. That's the title of section 2. Simple one, there's now a prompt to request the scope to specify what communication system you want to use for the contract. That's just good practice. And now when it comes to early warning, there's now a clear obligation on the PM to set up the first early warning register. That wasn't in NEC3, but it was sort of blindingly obvious because obviously the PM did that, but now it's in black and white. A new change is that now early warning meetings are now required to be not only when instructed, but also at no longer interval than the interval in the contract data. This is just good practice. And don't forget, I haven't said this, sorry, I should have said right at the very start, the strap line for NEC4 was evolution, not revolution. It was just making it better. And in many cases, that was picking up what has been happening with the contract in the real world. There's now a clearer clause for the contractor's proposals to change the client's scope. And in options C and D, the prices are not reduced. That's no change to the prices, because the way it works, if the contractor comes up with a bright idea, then we will leave the prices as they were. So the contractor comes up with a bright idea to save £1,000. Client says, yeah, okay, do that. But we don't reduce the price. And therefore we leave the target mechanism itself to incentivize that, because both parties will benefit from that. That's the same as it was in NEC3. The difference in NEC4 is that principle now applies also to the lump sum contracts. I now have an element in the contract data called the value engineering percentage. So if the value engineering percentage is 80 and the contractor comes up with a bright idea to save £100, effectively the client gets £80 saving, the contractor gets £20 saving. Would you believe it? For 20 years with NEC3, there was no such clause. So in NEC3, if the contractor came up with a great idea to save £1,000, the client changed the works information and brought the price down by £1,000, and the contractor got nothing out of it. That's not really fair. So to me, that's a very positive change from 3 to 4. In a PSC4, there is also now the concept of a scope provided by the consultant, in the same way that NEC3 has always had the works information provided by the contractor. So we now have that concept of a client scope and a consultant scope in PSC4, sorry, but the concept of the value engineering percentage is not in the PSC. Hope that's clear. 3 is program, time. Now this is one simple change which the market was crying out for, because the market said project managers are useless. They receive a program from the contractor and they sit on it. They put it in the in tray and they don't like to either accept it or not accept it. NEC4 now, there's a simple paragraph where if the project manager has not responded to a program within the 2 weeks which they're allowed and required to respond, the contractor may give a prompt, and if the PM is silent for another week, then the program NEC language is treated as accepted. Colloquially, we call that deemed accepted, but NEC says treated as accepted. That's a very, very good change to try and keep things moving and get the program sorted. That's in PSC and ECC. 4, testing and defects. Firstly, it's rebranded as quality management. And the main change is that we've stolen a clause from the PSC and stuck it in at the start of section 4 in the ECC. It's called quality, and now we have a specific reference, a requirement to use a quality management system. And again, as ever in NEC, in accordance with the requirements in the scope. So the person writing the scope has got to say your quality management system must be in accordance with ISO 9000 or whatever it is, and so on. There's also a requirement for a quality policy statement for acceptance of the PM, and also a quality plan for acceptance of the PM. Now I'm emphasizing the word PM because some of you on the call will recognize that most of the grunt work to do with, or all of the grunt work to do with testing and defects is done by the supervisor. But this new clause, these clauses, as you can see on the screen, the acceptance is not done by the supervisor, but done by the project manager. So another obvious point is that the PM and the supervisor hopefully will talk to each other when it comes to accepting those statements. Hence, is it odd that it's a PM? It could have been the supervisor, but it is what it is. It is the project manager. That's got to 4. Any questions, Robert, in 1 to 4?
No questions, Richard. You're giving key information, answering everyone's questions before they happen.
I'll either that or I'm doing it so fast people haven't got time to ask questions. I'll move on. Payment, some big changes in NEC4. Big changes. A very simple one is that in NEC3, even if the contractor didn't apply for money, the PM was still required to assess it and get the client to pay. That has changed. Now, if you don't apply by the assessment date, you don't get paid any money, and you'll have to wait till the next assessment date. I maybe shouldn't tell you this, but I mentioned this to the Mott MacDonald credit control team, and they were in apoplexy. Oh my God, we've got to apply on time. Shouldn't be that hard, should it? You just need to get it in somebody's diary. But that's a top tip for all of you out there. That is now a contractual requirement. If you don't submit your application, you ain't going to get paid until the month later. Pretty obvious thing to get sorted. In NEC3, it was complicated with 2 separate fee percentages, one for subcontracted work and one for the contractor's own work. That's gone away. Now there's just one single fee percentage applied to all defined cost. And when it comes to defined cost, in NEC3, there was a horrible clause which excluded the cost of preparing compensation events. That was only in options A and B, but it was horrible. When you were bidding, this was in the PSC and the ECC, and it meant when you were bidding, you just had to take a complete flyer on how much money you might have to spend preparing quotations for compensation events. Now that clause has gone away. I should say, because some of you will be thinking this, it's not quite as subtle as I show on the slide, because if to get any money for a compensation event for preparing compensation events, the supplier, when I use the word supplier, I mean either contractor or a consultant under ECC or PSC, the supplier is going to have to demonstrate an increase to their defined cost. When it comes to preparing compensation event quotations, the project manager, ECC, or the service manager, PSC, will still quite likely say, hang on, that didn't increase your defined cost because that was just your QS, and you had a QS there anyway. So it might not be quite so easy to get any more money, but at least we've taken out this ridiculous exclusion at the high level. As if by magic, I'm going ahead of myself. PSC 3 and 4, same story. Sorry, PSC and ECC, same story. Completely new clause. The market told NEC that they wanted a more clear process specifically about final assessment. This is a new clause 53. It wasn't there in NEC3, and effectively there's a detailed process in terms of a time scale. I'd need to read it myself because it's not one you're going to do very often. Obviously, you're only going to do it once on any particular job. But the PM has got 4 weeks after the defect certificate to prepare this final assessment, in which case the client pays the money. If the PM's useless and doesn't get round to it, the contractor has the opportunity to prepare their own final assessment, at which point I would hope the project manager will be sacked and or shot. Maybe a bit harsh. And one thing I'll highlight is this horrible word, conclusive evidence. Isn't that a horrible word? That's not NEC language. That's been stolen from some other horrible contract. But that's what it says. It's conclusive evidence of the final amount due. Obviously, unless one side or the other wants to take it through the dispute resolution process. And the words for that are in clause 53. PSC as well, same words. In options A and B, some really, really good detailed changes. Firstly, we have a short schedule of cost components. It used to be called shorter. You'll find out why in a minute. Short schedule of cost components. Nothing's changed in the sense that it's still only used for compensation events in the priced contracts A and B. So those of you that know NEC, it's difficult for me to know how much to say on a presentation like this, but the schedule of cost components is NEC's detailed rules for what defined cost is. If it's in that schedule, you can get paid it. If it ain't, you've got to cover it in your fee percentage. So we've got a new document called the short schedule. It's used only for compensation events. And yes, big change. For people in this, for a lump sum or a BOQ job, we now ask the bidder to give us people rates. So we're going to have a rate for a unskilled labourer, a rate for a joiner, a rate for the site agent. So when we need those people, we've already got a predetermined tendered rate that we use for those people. Those of you that remember NEC3, I hope it is remember, you're not still having to use it. If you've got a lump sum job under NEC3, the crazy NEC3 required you to go and find out the actual cost being paid to those people on site. Crazy for a lump sum contract. So now, simpler, we've just got people rates. We used to have, on top of the amount for people, there was also a percentage for people overheads. Sorry, take back again. Sorry, go back a stage, Richard. Sorry. NEC3 had a tendered percentage for people overheads to cover, to use a technical term, odds and sods on the site. The toilet paper, the toner cartridges, computing, bits and bobs. Rather than pay the real cost of those things, in NEC3, there was a tendered percentage for people overheads. That's gone away, and instead, we pay the real costs. Yes! Sorry, I get very excited by this. Someone's got to be excited. NEC3, we had to try and use this detailed schedule of cost components to work out how much we should pay for the subcontractors' people. Crazy idea. NEC4, a defined cost is now whatever the contractor pays to its subcontractor. Much simpler, much easier. There used to be, NEC3 has, and NEC4 have rates for design and manufacture, and they have rates for designers off the site. On top of those things, there used to be a tendered overhead percentage. God knows why. Why do we want a tendered percentage on top of a tendered rate? Surely we just include the overhead percentage within the rate. We didn't in 3, we do in 4. Makes it simpler when it comes to tender evaluation. Now then, cost-based options C, D, and E. This is where we're paying the contractor routinely for the real cost that they're incurring in doing the job. In the document called the Schedule of Cost Components, that hasn't changed. But the difference is with the cost-based options, C, D, and E, that's used, yes, for compensation events, but also for routine payments. That's not changed. That's as it was in 3. Simple difference. We've only now got the one schedule of cost components. In NEC3, it looks crazy now, but we used to also have a shorter schedule, which was used only for compensation events and only by agreement. Horrible, horrible additional complexity. Now, simply one schedule of cost components, a good thing. Again, the percentage for working area overheads, which is the equivalent of the people overheads in the lump sum and BOQ contracts, that famous percentage for working area overhead has been deleted. Now, the driver for that was that contractors would tender this percentage to cover these bits and pieces, and then somehow, obviously by accident, find themselves claiming the real cost of those bits and pieces again. Shock horror in their submission of defined cost. So there's a whole cadre of QSs on the client side who've had to go through those lists of defined costs with a highlight pen, trying to delete the cost of the toilet paper and the computing and the odds and sods. That's now not necessary, but instead the change and the problem that encourages now is that we now have to agree with the contractor the real cost of those relatively minor odds and sods. We're talking about the odds and sods as part of the contractor's prelims. Again, the payment to subcontractors, that used to be in the same, that was allowed in NEC3. The only subtle change from 3 to 4 is that the payment for subcontractors is now an element directly within the schedule of cost components. It doesn't actually change the effect of that. Again, no overhead percentage for design and the manufacturer rates. So that's actually a big issue if you're, I don't know whether you've got any QSs out there on the call, but this is going to change a lot in your day-to-day working. You need to get your head around these cost-based options. Maybe luckily, but since I have written this presentation, only a couple of weeks ago, I published a document in the NEC newsletter specifically on defined cost, which explains all that stuff I've been telling you about. What I'll do is ask Robert to share the link to that in the follow-up to this training session. And there's more. A new clause allowing contractor and project manager to basically agree when we think parts of defined cost are finalised. The word part is not defined. It's up to the PM and the contractor to have a bit of common sense on this. But the idea is that we have a clear process. The PM's got 13 weeks to review that part. Contractor responds to comments within 4 weeks. PM either accepts those comments or corrects it within 4 weeks. And if the PM misses that response time, the assessment is treated as correct. So what we've got is a process to try and get the PM and the contractor to get things sorted. Once it's been sorted, it's not up for the PM to come and correct it later. The reason for this was that there were some rather dodgy clients sending in consultants 3 years after the job to try and come and find some more costs to disallow. Heaven forfend. Surely you can't imagine any client doing that sort of thing. I'm sorry, but it happened. The idea of this process is to make that not an option. And radically, that's in the PSC4 as well. What, you mean there's real cost in the PSC4? Oh my word, surely not. I've left this till last. I hope you're still with me. I've gone over the hour. Robert did give me a possibility of going a little bit longer, so I hope this is still worthy of your time. I'm sorry if not. So this is radical. Suddenly consultants are being treated like contractors. Shock horror. Can't have that. I work for MacDonald. So in PSC3, we were just paid rates. and we were paid rates for target contract and for the reimbursable, option C and option E. Instead, we're now, I say we because I work as a consultant, we're now paid defined cost in a schedule of cost components, the same as for NEC3, not the same schedule, sorry, as ECC, not the same schedule, but the same language. It is the PSC schedule of cost components. On top of that, we get a fee. That detailed list for people is a very detailed list, and it's very, very close to a consultant's real cost to employ Richard Patterson. So if you employ Mott MacDonald and Mott MacDonald gives you Richard Patterson, as a client, you will see the real cost. I can tell you now it's not enough, but you will see the real cost of Richard Patterson, and you will be required to pay that real open book cost of the person. Consultants need to get their head around this in a big way and be good at keeping records of this. Let me give you some more detail. So the amount due has always been what it says on the slide. The price for services provided to date is now same language as ECC. This is only for options C and E, remember. Lump sum contract, priced activities as before. But in PSC3, C and E, we had tendered rates. In PSC4, we don't. What you pay out as a client is the total defined cost, which the service manager forecasts will have been paid by the consultant before the next assessment date, plus the tendered fee percentage. What's defined cost? It's whatever it says in the schedule of cost component. So you see my slide, we've just got to follow the threads in the contract to work out what all this means. Sorry, this is detailed, stay with me. Schedule of cost components, what does it look like? The box is going to fill, you'll be glad to know. Firstly, if it ain't defined cost, it's covered in the fee percentage, and the consultant's going to have to tender that fee percentage. For people, the consultant gets paid something very close to the real cost, as I've said. For subcontractors, they get paid the real cost to the subcontractors. But then, just to confuse things a little bit, you also get paid what's called a charge for the support people and office overheads. How is that charge calculated? It's an overhead percentage tendered times the people costs. The people costs are the ones that we've talked about in one. There's some words about insurances, but it doesn't include for premiums. Premiums, as in the ECC, will have to be covered in the fee percentage. This is getting quite complicated. Sorry, it's even more complicated because there's also the concept of disallowed cost in the same way as we've got used to over the last 20 years in the construction contract. Fee is fee percentage times the defined cost, which is the sum of 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4. And separately, totally separate to all this, if the client has allowed any expenses, those expenses get paid as a straight pass-through, not subject to the fee percentage. A lot of detail on that slide. I'm hoping or expecting there might be some questions, but I'm going to carry on. Am I going to carry on? Yes, I am going to carry on. If you're interested in that last slide, that's that one, then please go and have a look at another article that myself and a couple of colleagues wrote a couple of years ago when this first came out, specifically explaining everything I've just told you in a little bit more detail, understanding the new payment regime, and there's a link to it there. Again, Robert, any questions? There's one more session on compensation events. Any questions so far?
Yep, we've had one from Gary who said, you have stated that in the NEC4 there is no separate subcontract fee, but what if the client would prefer a particular subcontractor whereby there might be an additional cost to be borne?
Okay, big question. Firstly, you're right, you were listening correctly. There is one simple fee percentage which is applied to any cost incurred by the contractor, any defined cost. That defined cost includes payments to subcontractors. The end of the question was, what if the client wants a certain subcontractor? Well, that's a dangerous thing. That's nothing to do with this presentation, but if the client wants to put any constraints or requirements on subcontracting, that would need to be in the scope. If the client wants the contractor to choose, for example, between 2 or 3 or however many more previously accepted, or what do we call them? We quite have consultants, clients have a word for this. They have their sort of approved supplier list. You can write that into the scope, but you've got to be very careful that you don't start telling the contractor exactly which subcontractor to use. If you do that, you can't get away. It's what we used to call the nominated subcontractor in the old days, and it always causes problems because in theory you're getting the contractor to take the risk of that person, but if you told them they've got to use Fred and Fred turns out to be useless, you're going to end up in a problem. I'm not sure I've particularly well answered the question, but I'm going to stop there.
Excellent, thank you, Richard, and that's the final question.
Okay, finishing up then, compensation events. Firstly, yes, very simple, but in NEC4, we've now got a reference from the list in 60.1 to additional compensation events in the contract data part 1. So if you as a client want to add in an additional compensation event, you can just write it straight into the contract data. In NEC3, if you remember, that would have required an additional compensation event, but would have had to be put in a Z clause with an additional condition. This just makes it neater and easier. The concept of a proposed instruction, it was already there in NEC3, but it's much neater in NEC4. It's given its whole new clause, clause 65, and it's better set out and clearer to understand. One thing which is a good one, I like to think, in NEC3, a client could ask for quotations for proposed instructions. The client, the consultant, or the contractor spends 3 weeks putting together a nice quotation for that proposed instruction. The client says, "Oh, thanks, mate, but no, I don't want it." And the client or the consultant gets, sorry, the contractor or the consultant has no recompense for all the effort put into that instruction. Now, if we do ask for a proposed instruction and don't accept the quotation and therefore don't instruct it, that triggers a new compensation event so that the supplier can at least get paid for the hassle, or can at least, sorry, to be really pedantic, can at least get an increase in the prices for the work done in preparing that quotation. That, I think, is a good change. Another really good change is a very simple one, but we have the concept of a dividing date. NEC3 always said you get paid the actual cost up to, it didn't have a word for it, that was the problem. But it hasn't changed the principle, but now it's much clearer. We have a thing called the dividing date, which is effectively the date that the compensation event was notified. Everything up until the dividing date is based on actual. Everything in front after the dividing date, we have to forecast. That applies to both time and money. So it hasn't changed anything, it's just made it clearer. Also, we've made it much clearer that the program used for accepting for a compensation event, first we have to update it to the dividing date. Now that was implicit in NEC3, but it was quite hard to pull out. It's now explicit in NEC4 because the words are stated there. I think I might need to change the number on my slide there, because it's absolutely in black and white, not in 62.2, but in 63.5. All of those changes are exactly the same in the PSC because NEC is a family and we like to make it consistent across the two. W, final assessment. I've already mentioned this, I think. We've got this concept of senior representatives. So the process, the issue goes up to those senior representatives and then only goes to the adjudicator if the senior reps haven't sorted things out within 3 weeks. And as you'd expect, If the adjudicator can't sort it out, then we go on upwards to the tribunal, which is arbitration or the courts. W3 is that new one where we go to the dispute board and then on and up to the tribunal within 4 weeks of the DAB's recommendation. Oh, big change. So in summary, NEC called this evolution, not revolution, but there are some significant changes. Just as an indication, I give the training for NEC, which is 4 days for their project manager accreditation course. If you've got that for NEC3, you can upgrade it to NEC4 with a 1-day course, which will pick out some of the key things we've talked about today. Having said that, I should warn you, the course is quite, or the assessment is still quite stiff because you are actually trained on your understanding of NEC4, not just on the changes from 3 to 4, but all of 4. So that's quite tough to get yourself back up to speed in the 1-day course. I've shown you tonight, you've got new contracts, you've got new options. Some of what I've shown you are what I would describe as fixes where NEC3 wasn't really right. There are some good new ideas, and there's lots of tidying up improvements which has been learned from the best part of 12 years of experience with NEC3. That's the summary. One other article I'm pointing you to, I wrote more recently, was just a simple article in the NEC newsletter basically saying to clients, get on with it. Moving from 3 to 4 is a no-brainer. The only reason for sticking with 3 is obviously if you've got frameworks which are reliant on 3, it would be messy to move to 4. To warn you, NEC4, NEC3, NEC as an organization is no longer maintaining the NEC3 contracts. They are dead. And for a client, you should see it as an opportunity to improve your Z clauses, to improve and implement some more training. And obviously, if you do have templates for documents that were right for 3, they will need some attention to make them right for 4. Likewise, the communication forms, there are some subtle changes that you will need from 3 to 4. Hopefully you guys out there are using the in the cloud contract management systems, and as you would expect, all of those people flogging you in the cloud contract management systems have already put in the investment to give you an NEC4 version. Highly recommended. I am not on commission. Questions? Deep breath. Sorry, that went on a little bit longer than I would have hoped for, but I hope it was still worth your time. Really, really keen to have any questions because that's where people learn and it's a little bit more interesting.
Excellent. Thank you, Richard. As Richard says, we're happy to take your questions. There's been some great compliments, actually. First off, we've had, this is not really a question, but just to say this is very, very useful. That's from Prince Barotang from Ghana. So thanks for that.
Thank you very much. Happy to help in Ghana, as I mentioned before.
Perfect. And then Jason has said, similar to the ECC-PM, is there an accredited course for the service manager using the PSC?
Lovely question. Not yet to my knowledge. There is a accreditation for the TSC service manager, the term service contract, but at the moment I don't think there's been enough demand from the market for that for the PSC. I'm hoping that will probably be developed. We'll see how that works. But at the moment, though, no, that's not an option, I'm afraid. If you did the course for the ECC, any sensible client that knows anything about NEC would recognise that you've got the skills to do the PSC. Does that make sense? I hope so.
Excellent. Thank you, Richard. And then it's just, go on, sorry.
I was just going to say, on the Slido now, this is replicating what I always do with my training. I don't like fancy feedback forms and 1 to 10. The important thing for me is, in one sentence, what was good for today? And the next Slido is what will you improve? So I'm very happy for any constructive comments, but I'm liking what I'm seeing at the moment, that hopefully today's session was at least of some use for somebody out there. But again, if you've got any more questions, please do come with questions. I think I've lost my ability to show my slide at the moment, so that's fine. But if you've got any more, Richard made the fairly dry subject fairly engaging. Thank you very much. That's what I like to do. I have a strange passion in life, is making contracts less dull than they otherwise are.
But, no questions coming through at the minute, Richard. But again, just I can see that Robert posted the compliment in my little box as well as Slido. Mohammed Farah has said this was very informative, so thank you. So no technical questions, just lots of nice compliments, which is always good to see.
Well, I'm always happy to soak up compliments. Don't forget, I'm also happy to take back any suggestions for improving it. Like I say, all this stuff, this one and the previous 5 that I've given are there on the website of APM. And as I said, there's a couple of other papers and things that I will send links to Robert, and Robert's very good at sharing them with you. I don't know whether, Robert, you share them by email to those who attended, or whether it just goes on the website and they have to go and find it. I don't know. Either way, hopefully you'll pick up some of that additional information.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you, Richard. We definitely email everyone that's joined us tonight, and we'll give you a link through to a news article that will have a copy of this recording along with the slides. I actually quite enjoy the Dole survey, so there's also a survey there that I'd be grateful for people's feedback with the numbers and feedback, and we'll share those with Richard as well.
Okay, well, please do that, guys. Yeah.
At the minute, all I'm getting is nice compliments. So Nick says, thank you, very well presented and informative. Suzanne said, thank you very much.
That's fine. Okay, yeah, don't embarrass me with those. That's lovely. Thank you very much for those. I'm glad that as use of your time on a Wednesday night when you probably thought you should be doing something more exciting. Clients in the pack, that I think that presentation is enough to get people to understand what needs to be done with NEC4, I would like to think. That said, it is a change. You need to put in place a bit of a change management process in your organization to catch up with it, to decide what level of training, what you need to various people. And like I said, you need to go back to whoever wrote your horrible Z clauses for NEC3 and get them to think again and hopefully spin some of them, but you're obviously going to need to tweak them to match NEC4. Okay, well, if that's where we are, I think, Robert, unless you've got anything more, we can, I'll let you say goodbye.
No additional questions, just again, nice compliments coming through. And I'd just like to echo it, Richard, the last 5 or 6 webinars that we've done together, I've really enjoyed your time and your knowledge and your passion for NEC. So thank you for giving up your time.
That's just fine. As I said once, I'll just share this one with you because I like the story. Lunchtime talk at MacDonald. I found myself saying, I'm passionate about 3 things: NEC, MacDonald, knowledge management. And well, somebody from the back said, what about your wife? I thought it was quite a good line.
No, very good indeed. It really just also leaves me to say thank you to the volunteers of the APM Thames Valley branch who have worked with Richard to design these webinars over the last 6 months. So thank you for all your energy and achievements. And finally, I'd just like to say thank you to everyone who's joined us tonight, got involved in the Slidos, posted some really great questions. As Richard says, we are recording this and we'll send you a link so you can share with your friends or watch again. We're keen to hear your feedback, so please use the survey link in the control panel or the link that's sent to you in an email. But for me, it's really just say thank you, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your evening and we'll see you very soon. Bye for now.
Okay, bye now.